Europe is in a very bad situation. The European Union as a concept, which was supposed to basically be the savior for the Europeans, failed. Are they going to trust the American partner, or are they going to basically trust the Chinese? What Trump is doing is creating enemies everywhere. Trump is putting a wedge between Europe and America. Because Biden is a genius. If I was an American, I would definitely vote for Biden 100 times out of 100 times. It's going to be written in history that Trump messed up America forever.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the I3 Pulse. Did Trump just surrender Ukraine to Putin? And has America blindsided Europe, leaving them vulnerable and exposed? And is this the end of Ukraine as we know it? Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. How are you?
Assalamu alaikum.
So, Sheikh, Donald Trump called Zelensky the world's greatest salesman, a dictator. And then he shocked everyone by literally handing Ukraine over to Vladimir Putin on a silver platter. So 2 questions for you. Number 1, has Trump abandoned Ukraine? And 2, is he a Russian agent?
Which one do you want to start with first? The agent? Well, people did accuse him of being an agent and so forth, and they brought some history about his, financial dealings long time ago and so forth. Look, at the end of the day, even if there was some financial dealings, he's a businessman. He deals with everybody, with the Saudis, with the Europeans, with the Chinese. That's what it is, right? But him being an agent is total utter myth, right? He's not an agent for the KGB. This is stupid. And sorry to say it this way, but this is totally not factual in any way or sense. How do we know that? Well, we know that basically from the relationship. Now, Trump seemingly is getting closer to Russia. Yeah, definitely, this is what's happening. Not because he's an agent, because America right now is still powerful. It's still basically the agenda of America to weaken Russia is still there. But see, the first principle of international relations is that countries cooperate and compete at the same time. There's no such thing, I love you and therefore basically I'm just going to be a good friend, or I hate you, I'm going to be an enemy. In international relations, there's always maybe parallel relationships of competition in one theater and cooperation in another theater. And things fluctuate. Today we're competing, tomorrow we say, you know what, let's just this competition is burning both of us, let's just chill and cooperate for a little bit. Things change a little bit, a couple of years after, and competition happens. So, no, he's not an agent. Definitely he's not an agent. Anybody who basically is just, I would say this is almost like drama and entertainment. As far as your second question about, or your first question about, did Trump abandon Ukraine? We already said in our first ever episode about Ukraine that the whole war was manufactured in America for American, agenda. So definitely, who cares about Ukraine? In politicians, sadly, because it's a very secular perspective of politics, right? Which is what's in the whole Western world is the case. It's just not just Western world. Sorry, Western world and non-Western world. It's just a piece on it's a pawn in the chessboard. So Ukraine, from the beginning, the war, and we even basically explained how America came in and shifted the political elites in Ukraine until they got Zelensky as an agent. We said. To utilize the country to weaken Russia and to weaken also Europe and to create a disaster within that theater. So there's no such thing as abandoning. There's basically utilizing it, and then this piece, when it's played and it's over, the one who created this pawn, gets rid of it. Now, are they abandoning it? No. What's the most dangerous thing the United States is doing, which will hurt Ukraine and Europe? And many of the defense ministers in the Munich and post-Munich conference have said is that the United States is trying to play a big double game. There's two things the United States is trying to do right now, trying to create a ceasefire to appease the Russians for a specific negotiation that's happening, and we can discuss that. Number 2, they want to keep Ukraine in a way where the war could be reinstated in the future.
Why would they do that?
Well, because, again, the policy is the same. That the whole war was created to weaken both the Russians and the Europeans. To keep this, to perpetuate the crisis in Europe. It hurts Europe, and it makes the Russian bleed in that theater. So Trump wants to say, look, they want to create a negotiation, and we can discuss what are some of the possible outcomes of this negotiation. The Russians will not basically give the area that they conquered back. So this is maybe one of the positions of the Russians. And the Americans basically, they will force the Ukrainians for whatever benefit they want. What does the Americans want? We'll discuss that basically in a bit. So if the Americans can negotiate at least a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, sure, it's permanent today. 5 years from today, the whole thing can erupt again, right? So that's why the Germans and the Europeans, they want a complete solution forever. And but the Americans, what are they saying? They're saying, no. Ukraine cannot be in NATO. What would end this whole thing is if there's an agreement from the Russians that now Ukraine. If you look at Europe, most of Europe now is under NATO.
Yes.
Right?
Russia's
There's few
surrounded
little
pretty much.
exceptions like Switzerland and so forth.
Yeah.
But at least on the borders, the only basically missing piece, now Belarus is part of the Russian influence. But, aside from Belarus, it's Ukraine. If what the Europeans want is to basically reach an agreement with the Russians to include Ukraine under that defense treaty. And then that's it. Then basically the countries can compete on economic terms, for example, and so forth. Because Russia is not going to get into a fight with the whole Europe, and Europe is not going to basically get in a fight with the Russians.
But if Russia accepts that, that's pretty much, a done deal for them, right? If all the countries around them are part of NATO.
The reason Russia came into the war in the beginning is so it doesn't allow Ukraine into NATO. So now Trump is siding with the Russians because it's in the American interest to keep this war perpetuating against the national interest of the Ukrainians, which we already said basically the Americans are going to sell them to the Russians from day one. Before day one, this was planned in America. Now we're seeing the results. Whatever we said 3, 4, 5 months ago, whatever it is happening today. You see what I'm saying? Are they going to abandon it? No, because it can be utilized further. That's why the answer for the abandoning Ukraine is dual. They're abandoning them now, but not fully, so they can utilize them later.
My goodness. So the Ukrainians are literally the cannon fodder of
Oh,
the US.
100%. 100%. Literally, it's just like the Ukrainian people need to understand the Americans are using them as pure pawns. They don't care about nothing. They don't care about Ukraine or Ukrainian lives. And definitely they don't care about Europe either. And the Europeans don't care about Ukraine because of Ukraine. They just need stability within the continent. This is sadly what happens basically in geopolitics within a materialistic viewpoint about the world. In Islam, we don't do that. In Islam, basically, we care about human life. In Islam, we care about animals. In Islam, we care about even the trees and the plants and the atmosphere. But this is the world we're living in today.
Yeah, you can even see in the pictures, like Ukraine is just devastated in the east. It's just like even the buildings, it's just rubble. Now, you mentioned Putin and Trump, but there's a dynamic here. What will make Putin consider a peace deal? Like, I'm trying to understand, what will America benefit? What is Russia going to benefit out of this peace deal?
So look, let's understand, what is the American intent? What's the biggest American goal? Is to create a wedge between Russia and China. During the Biden administration, both American presidents or both parties, the American foreign policy shifted to make the number one threat for America China. This does not change over time. This does not change like even over years. This changes over decades. So what people need to understand that the biggest threat for America for the next maybe 20 years plus will continue to be China. Will continue to be China. Okay, unless maybe an event that happens, for example, something out of the ordinary, whatever it is, that just changes this. But things don't change like that out of the ordinary, right? So, Tayyip, the Biden administration took a specific strategy of getting Europe closer to America, furthering Europe away from China, creating the Ukraine war to devastate Russia, and for the sake of weakening Russia as a mechanism to force it away from China. So now Trump comes in, and by the way, both administrations want a weak Europe, a weak Russia, a weak China.
My goodness, these guys are lunatics.
But this is how it is.
Yeah,
this is the geopolitics, right? The world. Sadly, this is what it is. This is the game of nations. This is the game of empires.
So, Sheikh, are you saying that then Joe Biden actually had a strategy? Because Trump was literally posting on Truth Social saying that Zelensky was playing Biden like a fiddle, and Biden was being compromised and tricked, or being, his weakness being preyed upon, and all that stuff.
Yeah, so this is part of the internal politics. You need to understand basically there's a big divide in America. In America, now we're going to the era of the pre-Civil War,
Yeah.
where basically there's actual two factions in the United States that are, they hate each other. So this is part of basically these two factions really like, taking shots at each other and so forth, and it's serious stuff. But actually, if I was an American, and if I was a patriot in America,
Yeah.
I would definitely vote for Biden 100 times out of 100 times.
Okay, tell me, because this is Sleepy Joe Shack. Tell us why we.
Oh, because Biden is a genius, really.
Yeah, okay.
People think he's an idiot, but Biden is one of the masterminds of American foreign policy. Like he's not an idiot. Like for example, what's his name? Ronald Reagan was an actor.
Yeah.
Like this guy has been in Congress for like 50 years or something.
Yeah.
So that's number one. So, but look at the strategy. Look at how basically Biden, for example, Biden came after Trump, right?
Yes.
Trump created a very aggressive war against China, economic war against China, trade war against China. Biden came and doubled down on it. Actually, increased the tariffs in certain cases and increased other products to what's set upon China. So you need to understand the American strategy of weakening, accommodating, and literally like limiting Chinese abilities. Both parties are going to do. It's just how do you do it. But Biden understood that if you can keep Europe beside him, right, and create a problem both sadly for Europe also. But at least the Europeans were more happy with Biden. Biden was treating the Europeans better. Getting them closer, which means what? If the Europeans are closer to the Americans, they're farther away from both Russia and China. You see what I'm saying? Yes. And the war, the Ukraine war that he created, creates even a bigger wedge between the Russians and the Europeans. So the Biden administration knew, because see what's happening right now. What's happening right now with Trump? The Europeans are left after the Munich conference and the speech by the vice president. The Europeans are felt betrayed by the Americans. The Europeans are felt betrayed by the Americans. Done. So now they need to get their act together and make a strategy. What would that strategy be? Well, falling on the lap of China is a possible one. You see what I'm saying? Now the Americans are definitely the Americans right now. They're preventing that because if European companies deal with China in specific areas, industrial areas or sectors in the economy, the Americans will basically punish them. So Europeans cannot handle more punishment. They're already being punished in a million ways by the Americans. So they might not do it today, but what's happening is basically this strategic planning that's happening in Europe today. How do we pick up from their perspective? How do they pick up themselves up? And what do they do in the next 20, 30 years? They need to have a strategic plan. Are they going to trust the American partner or are they going to basically trust the Chinese? And the Chinese are already speaking about it. They're trying to basically strengthen their relationship with Europe. Already. They're already speaking about this. There's no speculation here. It's just now the question is basically when do they do it, how do they do it, and when does the Europeans start speaking about it in the open? At the official level. Intellectuals in Europe, they're speaking about it. But definitely there's this, it's not a positive thing. Europe is now between a rock and a hard place. Like who the heck said basically that, falling into the lap of China is better than falling into the lap of or underneath the feet of the Americans. This is going to screw you over and this is going to screw you over. So to say that. So you're going to get beaten up here, you're going to get beaten up here. So both sadly Europe is in a very bad situation in their history. And things don't change over time because they made so many mistakes over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They didn't invest right. They didn't unify right. They didn't. It's kind of like they have the same problems with Muslims. The European Union as a concept, which was supposed to basically be the savior for the Europeans, failed. And when you can't unify, you're divided. When you're divided, you're weak. The European Union exists, but this framework is shaky. Okay. It's not as strong as the federal government in the United States. It's not as strong as the Communist Party in China. It's not as strong as the authoritarian Tsarist regime in Russia, quote unquote, right? So who's the weakest? The weakest is the Europeans. Russia is unified. China is unified. The United States is unified for now. They have to pay the price, and then paying the price might take decades. The Europeans right now, they do not know what they're doing. Okay, they're trying to figure things out. Well, let's see. But what I'm trying to say is that Trump is pushing them. The Trump game is to put a wedge between Moscow and Beijing. So what's happening right now, basically, is that really going to happen? Well, this is what Nixon did in the 70s, when he sent Kissinger to China. But see, there's a big difference between that and now. The Chinese and the Russia and the Soviet Union at that time were actually competing.
Yes.
They hated each other. There was actually some wars between them in 1969 due to border issues. And from an ideological perspective, they were actually they were almost in competition. So the Americans came and said to one of them, "Look, we can support you. You can beat your competition." Things were natural. The putting a wedge within such a situation or such a relationship was easy. Right now, the Russians and the Chinese know this. They already know that basically, if they have a strategic alliance with each other, 100% for long-term strategic alliance between each other. So, is Trump going to be able to actually do that, or is he going to basically push, let's say, Russia a little bit away, where the Russians tell the Chinese, "Look, we're still with you guys," and so forth. But what is the Americans going to demand? Sadly, what many analysts are saying, and I see this as a big possibility from the beginning, is that sadly Trump is putting a wedge between the West, between Europe and America. See, historically, Europe and America were supposed to be one side versus the Communist Pact, which is China, Russia. Okay, so in the 70s, the Americans have been able to they succeeded at putting a wedge between this communist camp. Today, this the same what they call the reverse Nixon, yeah, the same wedge being put between China and America might backfire at the West, which is causing Europe and America having a wedge between them. This is what I'm trying to say. So it's a very dangerous. What Trump? That's why I said earlier, basically, I would vote for Biden, because what Trump is doing is creating enemies everywhere. I mean, he already offended the Canadians because they're weak. The Canadians also were not prepared, just like the Europeans.
Governor Trudeau, yeah.
What happened? The Chinese says, "Well, we'll take care of you," and the Canadians today are saying, "Well, yeah, there's lots of oil now is going to go to China." So what Trump is doing, instead of putting a wedge between the Russians and the Chinese, sadly he's putting a wedge between him and everybody else in the Western world. That basically is a huge strategic mistake for Trump, that America will pay for it for the next decades to come. I believe it's irreversible. Because, see, one lesson about trust, in organizational psychology, is that to build trust takes a long time. But to break it, it takes a second. And that's why the impact of what Trump have done to the Canadians and the Europeans, I think, is irreversible already. Because they both felt that, this partner of ours just backstabbed us and we can't trust him. We cannot trust him anymore.
Speaking of what America has been saying about Europe and the situation there, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, has been saying some pretty crazy stuff. Like recently, he said that number one, Ukraine's NATO membership is not a realistic outcome of peace talks.
Yep.
And mentioned that there's no way they're going to return to their 2014 borders. So I guess a question here is, given that we see Macron and Keir Starmer from the UK, they're set to visit Trump in this upcoming week. It seems like they want to diffuse the situation. I guess how are they going to be able to diffuse it, given all these crazy things that are being said from their perspective on Ukraine, and why the two of these countries?
Well, these are the leaders of Europe, really. Germans sadly are within the pocket of America. But at the end of the day, the Americans told you, the Europeans, you have no role in the negotiations. These guys are now running to the Americans to say, "Hey, can you help us? Can you take our interest into account?" But as I said earlier, so one of the things that the Americans will give Putin is, first of all, they will approve annexation of these areas in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. This will become, at least from an American perspective, Russians. The second thing is basically they will also deny whatever was left of Ukraine to enter NATO, which is also Russian interest. This is what America is paying. So the Americans are coming to Putin with three things. They said, "Look, we will oppose Ukraine going into NATO. We will basically approve of the areas that you took over, and we will basically stop funding the war and we'll stop the war for you." So this is what the Americans are putting on the table. What is the ask for the Russians is what we need to know, because it's not announced yet. But definitely we understand what is the objective. The objective is basically splitting the Russians from the Chinese. The Russians knows this, and the Chinese know this. Okay, will they basically be able to achieve creating distrust between this camp? I personally believe no. But it's going to be fun to watch, and definitely I could be mistaken. But I believe it's going to be way harder than what Nixon and Kissinger did. People think it was like genius. Well, they were already at each other's throats, so it was easier then. Right now, they both learned the lesson, come 50 years after, and they understand that they're both strategic interests with each other. Now, Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. This is now. Before, maybe if you spoke to me about this maybe 10, 15 years ago, China still needed loss from Russia because Russia was technologically advanced, way advanced. But in the last 10, 15 years, the Chinese took everything from Russia, almost. There's almost nothing that the Russians need. Maybe the Chinese needs from Russia. Maybe a little bit, but we're talking about 1% compared to like maybe 40%, 10, 15 years ago, maybe even more. So the Russians know. The Russians know that their life support is with China. They trust the Chinese. The Chinese said, "Look, we will take care of you 100%. We should never fall into the trap of being, tricked twice in the same way by the Americans." So and I believe they strengthened this relationship for the last 20 years, last 20, 25 years. 20 years, at least, those two countries signed so many strategic, long-term relationships with each other, created so much dependencies upon each other from a military, intelligence, economic, trade, political alliances perspective that they are tied to each other a lot already. But let's see if the Trump administration is successful in putting a wedge, this would be a huge victory. This is what I would say. Basically, Trump would come out victorious, and it would be a genius. And I'll be mistaken. Today I said basically I would vote 100 times, for Biden against Trump, because the foreign policy that Biden have created and crafted is way more mature from a geopolitical perspective, and it's not as risky. So Trump comes from the business world. He's going for high risk, high
reward,
outcome, how reward, and sadly it's high risk. And if he misses, I'm telling you, it's going to be written in history that Trump messed up America forever. Yeah, it's very high stakes stuff. This is very high stakes stuff.
So after Marco Rubio's meeting with Sergei Lavrov in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, he mentioned a couple of things that were discussed briefly. One of them being, diplomatic ties, building that relationship back again between the U.S. and Russia. And the second, there are talks about the U.S. and Russia working together and collaborating when it comes to the Arctic. What does that mean?
It's very good because now, look, there's 5 countries that are Arctic countries, right? So it's Finland, Denmark, Canada, U.S. and Russia. These routes, after the ice melts, after the ice keeps melting and the technology for icebreakers and so forth gets more advanced, will become the de facto routes for lots of the world trade. A good chunk of the world trade will now basically find another route. You see what I'm saying? It's going to be way more cost effective, and cheaper, and from a time perspective, quicker. So it seems basically they want to have an understanding where basically the U.S. and Russia dominates world trade. That's going to give now Russia an advantage over China. See, this is how basically the Americans are going to do. The Americans are going to try to prop up Russia. They're going to strengthen Russia, so it becomes now a bigger partner. So when they negotiate with the Chinese, they have leverage. And then bit by bit they can basically say, well, look, you're way stronger anyway, and they pull them apart from each other this way. So, but we need to wait for the details. There's lots. The second thing you mentioned is basically this whole thing about the embassies. The main job of the embassy is espionage. We just need to say it as it is, right? Like this is I3 Pulse, right? Yeah. So the reason they kicked out each other's people is because now they needed to stop the spying operations and the intelligence operations. So with it seems the Americans need that, a step back into Russia, and the Russians will basically do the same. So there's lots that happens basically in the covert world, within the intelligence agencies and so forth. So we need to also wait, see how they're going to utilize that, and what's going to come up in the news, and how they're going to impact Chinese relations or European relations, but mainly Chinese relations.
So now, on the other hand, I just saw this article on the Reuters report just a couple hours ago, where it mentioned that on Tuesday, we all know that Trump mentioned, oh, Ukraine started the war, right, when Trump got mad at Zelensky. And then he actually reversed course today. So he mentioned that just today, on Friday, that Russia did in fact invade Ukraine. And this is the interesting part. And Ukraine will soon sign a minerals agreement with the United States as part of an effort to end the Ukraine war. So what does that mean? Like, what's this minerals agreement? Is this benefiting?
Not to end the war, but to actually keep supporting Ukraine. So the Americans are telling Ukrainians, look, if you don't pay us and give us a good chunk of the minerals that you have, we're not going to support you anymore. So for the Americans to keep supporting Ukraine,
These guys are crazy.
it's businesses everywhere.
Wow.
And these minerals are very important because the Chinese own lots of the rare earth minerals in the world. I think they own around 50%, and they process around 90%. And they're putting tariffs and blocking some going to the United States, which will hurt America actually a lot. So now the Americans are trying to find alternative supplies, and Ukraine has rare earth metals, other minerals. So the Americans are going to grab all that, and again, who's the loser? The people of Ukraine.
They're literally being used in a war like cannon fodder. Lost their land, part of their country.
Oh, yeah.
They're not even part of NATO. Then their minerals are being taken. It's just crazy. Like, they seem like. I guess I want to ask you, Sheikh, before I go with this question, one more thing about the minerals. What specific things does Ukraine have? You mentioned rare earth minerals and stuff. What can America use with it? Because viewers might be thinking, okay, minerals sound nice. Okay, I have minerals, but what can America leverage these minerals for?
These rare earth metals are used for the high tech industry. So you cannot this lithium and other stuff basically that gets used for the electric batteries and the electric vehicles and lots of semiconductors and stuff like that. So without these metals and minerals, you can't continue with the industrialization of the country, and that's why lots of stuff will stop, like chip making, car making, electric vehicles making. Heavy machinery, lots of stuff basically will be impacted if you don't have access to these raw material. And as I said, basically China dominates this market. Because China was manufacturing everything for the world. Like, don't forget, the American companies were in China to manufacture everything.
Yeah.
So the supply chains of the world were all going into China. The Americans are trying to change that now. You see what I'm saying? So some independence at home, and then some goes to India and other world countries that are American American allies.
So Ukraine seems like a big loser in this situation, and I want to talk a bit more
We
about.
said Ukraine is a big loser from day one.
Yes.
Like, people need to understand that sadly the Ukrainians were tricked by the Americans. How did they trick them? They told them, look, you want some Western McDonald's and Hollywood and freedoms and liberty of America and democracy? Well, this is what they got. I'm not saying that basically, I'm not the type of person who will say basically I'm okay with dictatorship. As Muslims, the number one idea that we believe in as Muslims, people don't know this about Islam, is that we're anti-human subjugation. We're anti-human oppression. We're anti-human, injustice. So definitely, I'm not going to say, well, stay under the Soviet Union or the post-Soviet Union Russians and don't listen. But see, America also tricked you. It gave you a mirage of freedom to use you as a pawn on the geopolitical game. This is reality. This is the facts.
So Europe seeing this, what America
Just kind of like what they did with Iraq. They went to
Yeah.
Iraq, like, we want to give you democracy, and look what democracy they gave them.
Well, this is why
Iran is what the Americans gave Iraq. You see what I'm saying?
And this is why, from that perspective, from a moral perspective, America is not really seen as a leader anymore, right? Because of all these things that's been happening. And going to Europe, now that Europe is seeing what America is doing to Ukraine, right? Because it's different doing it to the Middle East, right? These are different people, but doing this in Europe. Now Pete Hegseth is mentioning, Secretary of Defense, that Europe needs to spend more than 2%. President Trump has called for 5%.
Yeah, they're calling for 5%.
Yes.
5% is like undoable. They're barely doing the 2%.
And majority of them are barely even struggling to keep the 2%.
Yeah.
So what leverage does the U.S. have to get Europe to do what they want? Like, do they have leverage over Europe? Because, for example, like if you look at Turkey,
Yeah.
when they have problems with Europe, they'll just say, "Oh, I'm just going to open the doors and let all the immigrants and migrants go into Europe and flood Europe." Like, what leverage does America have over Europe?
Support, like right now, if you look at the NATO expenditure, or sorry, the NATO funding, the Americans are paying more than one third of the bill. So if they take that out, who's going to fund NATO? Like imagine basically, to say you have a business, right? You lose 40% of your funding or 35% of your funding. We're not speaking about 2% or 3%. 2-3% will impact the business.
Yes.
We're saying 35%. So the leverage that America has is the dependency of Europe on America for defense, for security, for trade and so forth. But specifically, we're speaking about security. Europe cannot defend itself, neither from Russia nor from China nor from anybody else. So if the Americans pull out, this is the leverage basically.
So is this the end of Europe? Then from that perspective, this is really Europe's
I don't
downfall
think the
from
Americans will allow the end of Europe, but they want a weaker Europe. They want a subservient Europe to American interest.
Now, speaking of the future of Europe, we're seeing a lot of far-right populist leaders being propped up. We're seeing even Elon Musk talking and pushing these far-right populist leaders in Europe. Is this a product of the social instability that's happening in Europe? We're seeing German economies going down. Other nations' economies are going down. What do you expect to see over the next, let's say, terms and like what's ahead for Europe?
No, for Europe, as I said, this is pretty bleak. Like the Europeans right now, they need to unify. Like we speak, I speak to the Muslims. Sadly, but people don't get it that there's really one way for strength, is integration, unification, right? Number two is basically independence. Like they lived under the American umbrella for a long, long time. So when Trump comes and says, look, we're sick and tired of basically you guys using us. Well, to be honest, man, why would you do that? Why would you allow? You didn't have sovereignty. You didn't have full sovereignty. You relied after World War II by 5 years, 10 years is understandable. Now after that, I mean, for God's sakes, you're supposed to go and become an independent continent. But again, Europe historically is known for basically these constant fights between them. Like the Peace of Westphalia happened after these Europeans almost crushed themselves to death, right? As a continent. Millions of deaths at that time. These numbers are staggering at that time. We're speaking basically, I think the continent losing 10% or 15% of its population. I don't have the exact numbers, but big, large numbers. So it's what unifies people is an idea. And when the idea that the nations are built upon is self-interest, the other thing basically I would say, Europeans aligning themselves with the Chinese. Right? Like we need to understand the Americans are trying to weaken Europe, Russia, and China. Period.
Everybody, yeah.
Right? So they need to recognize that, maybe having an alliance with the Chinese gives them a little bit more space to maneuver. Like the Canadians. The Canadians right now are already saying we're going to now sell our energy resources to China. Why? Because it strengthens the Canadian economy, strengthens the Canada against the United States. This diversification makes Canada stronger. Don't you want a stronger Canada? I want a stronger Canada too.
Of course.
Like, what do you mean 51st state? Maybe it should be the other way around, Maybe we need to grab a few states from the United States. So this is how it works. Like, do I see the Europeans doing that? I think they would. I think the French are already basically dealing with it, but they're trying to basically be, in the middle, where they have a strong relation with both, and they use that as a negotiation card. The last thing I would say basically is that Europe should just go and negotiate with the Russians directly.
But do they have that? Do they have that influence to be able to do that?
They definitely have, but they don't have the political will.
And why is
because of these populist parties.
Because they want to be isolationist, I'm
Yeah.
assuming. This might sound like a conspiracy.
Because just to let you know, see, the Russians, they have lots of energy resources, which Europe needs. And the Russians also need the access to the markets in Europe and so forth. So they can easily integrate each other. But why do you think the Americans came and blew up the pipelines between Germany and Russia? You know what I'm saying? Because now Europe is more dependent upon the United States. So if they resolve their issues with the Russians, and they resolve and they get closer with the Chinese, then things the Europeans will be in a stronger position to negotiate with the United States. Right now, they're not prepared for either. They are enemies to the Russians. They have good relationship with the Chinese, but with lots of restrictions, and the reason because the Americans forced them to. So it's a meticulous untangling. It's not going to happen overnight. But the Europeans need to come together and say, look, the Americans are here trying to smash us to pieces. So if they don't recognize that, they'll just find themselves into pieces. That's all what I can say.
So you mentioned something, Sheikh. Is it a conspiracy theory? Because now a lot of things are puzzle pieces are fitting in my mind right now, and I think in the viewers that a lot of populist right-wing European leaders not having the political will to actually exercise their leverage. Is this like it seems very convenient for the U.S. that this is happening, right? Is there any correlation between these two things?
Yeah, no, there are lots of information that shows that I'm not saying basically the Americans built the right wing populist movement in Europe. I think the right wing is a natural reaction to the leftist ideology.
Yeah.
Right? There's this ultra leftist, neo liberal, neo modernist ideology, right? So, but I think the Americans funded it. The Americans helped in some of these political parties, and that means basically the old deep state now has a challenger. So things become a little bit less stable. See, stability leads to progress. Stability leads to progress leads to strength, right? So when you don't have stability and there's multiple factions now competing, this competition leads to weakness, and weakness leads to. So that's the problem. This is what's happening in Europe. There's no unified way forward for the Europeans, right?
I think everything that we covered today, Sheikh, just shows how high level these like really sinister this strategy for how to run the world is today, right? It's just about like destroying every single other potential opponent and just really dominating the world, and which is why this world is in such a bad shape. And so I want to end with this question.
Survival of the fittest
Yes.
is what it is. It's like.
So as I want to end with this question, Sheikh, with America pulling out of Europe and letting it deal with the situation in Europe, would Russia invade Europe?
Would Russia invade Europe is I would say is a very long shot. I mean, the reason basically Putin is rushing to Trump to make a deal is because Russia was I don't say devastated, but was really hit hard by this war. They couldn't invade all of Ukraine. They have the number of casualties is very high. The economy was hit. The social frustration. There's a million things. So I don't think basically Russia can like invade another country to even basically invade all of Europe. So it's not, definitely not. Are the Europeans able to like withstand the shock? I think the Europeans are less prepared than Russians. That's true, but I don't think the Russians are able now to open another war. It's not probably not.
So now they may not be able to, but with the U.S. trying to drive a wedge between Russia and China and Russia becoming stronger over time, is there potential for a World War III?
The World War III would basically be more possible between China and the United States. The Russians, look, the Putin understands the game. Everybody understands the game. As you can see in Ukraine, he was doing the least he can because he knew it was for to make him bleed, right? It's a war to just cause the Russian economy to implode and the society to implode. So he did not invade Kiev. He did not basically go into the big urban cities in the West. He just took over the Russian areas. There's Russian population, took over these areas, which cemented his power and created a little bit more buffer zone from Moscow, from the European side. And that's it. He used basically kind of like cheaper equipment from Iran, from North Korea. So he understood the game. The game is supply chain and economics more than anything else. So I would say basically no. Neither the Europeans nor the Russians would do that. I mean, Putin will threaten with this stuff, but Europe is pretty close to Russia, so you nuke Europe, you're nuking yourself, really. But between the Russians and between the Chinese and the United States, sadly, it's possible. It's a very dangerous world we're living in.
Well, we'll keep watching this space because these things are very critical and important. And Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh, for your time, as always. And we'll tell everybody, got to like, comment, subscribe, share. This is very important topics, very critical topics, really connecting all the different pieces and dots that you might hear from different places, all in one platform on the i3 Pulse. See you all in the next episode. Assalamu alaikum.